He is a great friend of the environmental community and a welcome and powerful voice. Bishop Sutton.
Hi, I'm Eugene Sutton, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland, and I want to welcome all of you to the training this evening offered on environmental justice by the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. Since I came to Baltimore 12 years ago, I've seen all too well and up close the intersectionality, that is, the interrelationship between the issues of poverty, violence, racism, and the degradation of the environment. And that's why I'm impressed by the great passion that all of you have for the land on which we live and for all of its inhabitants. For on this Mother Earth, the precious work of our Creator, this fragile earth, our island home. My hope is that you will learn much this evening and take this work out into the world, leading all of us to do more to protect our home and the health and safety of all who live in it. I'd like to offer an opening prayer, adapted from a prayer by Pope Francis. Let us pray. Creator God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of creatures. You embrace with tenderness all that exists and pour out upon us the power of love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. Tender of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey upon it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature. Encourage us, we pray, in this our struggle for justice, for love, for peace, for this earth. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Tamara Toles O'Laughlin. Tamara is the North American director of 350.org, and in that capacity, she drives mission-critical work and organizational investments to build a multiracial, multi-generational climate movement that's capable of holding our leaders accountable to science and justice. Prior to joining 350.org, Tamara was the executive director of the Maryland Environmental Health Network in Baltimore, which is where I had the privilege of meeting her, and where she championed its mission to promote the elimination of environmental threats to human health. Tamara graduated from the Vermont Law School in 2009 with the Juris Doctor and Masters of Environmental Law and Policy. Tamara has been one of the earliest and most passionate, and I would add successful advocates for an environmental human rights amendment here in Maryland. And on top of all that, I am pleased and honored to call Tamara my friend. As Tamara speaks with us, we invite you all to put your questions in the chat so that we may turn to them at the end of her presentation. And Tamara, I am thrilled that you are here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, my friend. It is a pleasure to be here with you and to connect with your community this evening. I am going to confess that my heart is a little heavy. The environmental justice community is dealing with the transition of a real pillar in our national community. Cecil Corbin Mark is in critical care in New York, having been the right hand of justice at We Act for Environmental Justice for the last 15, 20 years now. And we just got this news today. So I just want to confess that I'm a little less sprightly than I might be at 7 p.m. Normally. I'm going to share my screen because there are a lot of things I want to share tonight. Also, before I get going too much, I would like to just do a quick land acknowledgement of the fact that I am calling from Baltimore this evening. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and the land that I am currently on is the unceded territory of the Lumbee, the Piscataway, and the Cherokee tribe. So just want to make sure that I'm grounding myself in the things that are, while we are all a part of the things that will be. So this is a little bit, I'm gonna run a couple of slides about the work in general, but I like to start with a little bit of information about myself. So this is everything one could know about me in slide form. The things that I value: community, equity, access, humanity. If we don't have humor, as Vernice Miller Travis would say, you're just at work. So I'm really excited to share some of this information about how the environmental justice framework really informs the way we work. EJ, in and of itself, of the many things I will say and attribute to it, one thing that I will be clear on is that it is a lens that makes systems show up, that surfaces the inequalities in a system. It is not a separate body of work. It is like a filter, and you put it on a system and it lets you know where the disparities are, what they're connected to, and the question of race, which is an American problem that runs through the determination of who gets benefits and who gets burdens. So that's like the big picture of where we're going to go. But this document that you're looking at, the first slide is everything I love. The middle part of it are the idea that I don't have a work-life balance. Nina can tell you that. So it's just one life, so I'm doing all of it. And the spheres that you see are the places where I can call someone in the middle of the night and say, I don't know what that word means. How do you say that? Can you tell it to me like I'm 2 years old? So the places where I go to continually get wisdom and to live my purpose. Some of the other places where I do this work are the Green Leadership Trust, which is all board members of color of big green groups. So if they're a big green group and there are people of color working there, we connect to figure out how we can use our shared vision of who's being left out of the conversation to steer orgs that love us into places that serve us as people, as community members. I'm also the chair of the Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, where I mostly just get really great data about stuff going on in Maryland that it's very difficult to get from the Maryland government on air, climate, and our relationship to having clean air. The other place where I do my service work is as the chair of the Women's Voices for the Earth in Missoula, Montana, where we work on taking chemicals out of toxic products. So if you are battling in your kitchen against things with lots of chemicals, we should talk, because Women's Voices for the Earth has been working for over 2 decades to make sure that we are confronting chemicals where they show up in your kitchen and in your bathroom before you leave your home to mess with your life. 350 is where I am all day, most days. And the work I do there is highlighted in the green part of our mission. So the whole organization, which most people know through one of our founders, Bill McKibben, is really quite focused on ending the reign of fossil fuels, not spending another penny on it when we could be building the future, and focusing on how we keep it in the ground so that we don't raise emissions and destroy the planet that we are stewarding. My work there as the North America director for the US and Canada is really focusing on how we make that work multiracial and multi-generational, and how we include people, how we roll out the welcome mat, because this stuff can be very daunting. Tonight, I would like to talk to you a little bit about environmental justice, which I have said in climate space on issues of emissions and greenhouse gases and methane and fracking and all the things that have defined my environmental life in Maryland. That work of climate and emissions focused work is a leaf on the tree on the branch of social justice. And part of why that's true is because it comes from a larger tradition of deeper work that has been about whole communities trying to find themselves when they've been left out of a lot of choices. And I am going to talk to you about why that is. So to be fair, this will not be a politically pointed conversation, but politics that surrounds everything we're doing, particularly in this environment. So I want to flag that part of why environmental justice is a really crucial framework isn't just because it came from oppressed people, people looking to figure out how they can be reintegrated into the conversation around decisions that impact them, but because the political questions of people and planet are wrapped up in whether or not our humanity is made visible in those conversations. Environmental justice helps us to do that. I'm going to provide a little bit of a timeline around when the benchmarks for environmental justice have really started to open up the public dialogue. It's prefaced on the idea that of the ways that the environment can harm people, the single largest determinant of whether or not you will suffer at the hands of an environmental exposure, of the toxic chemicals, of poor air quality is race. Of all the other ways that you can look at that data, the likely determinant of whether or not your zip code will kill you is your race. And that's a set of decisions that we've made and enshrined in lots of systems. So in thinking about this work and its early roots in public mobilizations for environmental justice in the early 60s, in the federal government looking up, following behind decisions in the Carolinas, in the Warren County, specifically as people are demanding not to have pollution show up in their front yard and their backyard without talking to them, and folks working with faith leaders and communities to say, why is this happening? I did not know it was happening here. Why is my health and that of my family and the next generation being sacrificed without my knowledge? So that's the earnest sort of background of where we came from. In 1991, several folks who had been involved in raising those issues so that the federal government would step in to try to stop industry from eating up people's lives and poisoning their water and their food and their air and making their homes a dumping ground. Folks, just a bunch of advocates got together in 1991 to talk about the principles of what they think has to be said about why this would happen, what we have to do to stop doing it. And we have been working on making that a reality ever since. It involved faith leaders and community folks, farmers, and folks who have just been left out of the conversation, and has evolved to a body of work that really analyzes where the system is failing us. In 1994, President Bill Clinton, among many things that he is known for, also established the only executive order on record that makes environmental justice a priority for what happens in the federal government. This particular current administration has always considered moving it, changing it. It can be written in, it can be written out of the law as an executive order, but Executive Order 12898 is the thin line for whether or not the federal government's procurement dollars, power of the purse, ability to convene for investigations and to send out data that makes sense to people about what's happening to them is all tied to a federal government imperative coming from the executive that we should study those things.
Mark, can I just interrupt a sec? Can you go to slide of the presentation mode so that the picture is larger for people so they can see it a little bit better?
Yeah, something odd is happening. Let me see what I can do, because it's being very odd. Okay, now we're gonna jump right into my computer. Hold on one sec. Now I'm gonna stop sharing so that I can try to fix that. So while we're waiting for my slide deck to come back up, I want to just continue talking about the idea that it took from the 60s of people making a stand for really basic things, asking to be seen and to be heard, to 1991 when enough folks got together to say, this just doesn't seem right. This just doesn't feel right. It is not right, for the federal government to start to respond. So it's been really, it's been really a work of many generations to get to this moment. I think I've been able to fix that, so we'll see if it works. Okay. All right, now that's fully grown.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for the heads up. So yeah, we're in a place where 30 years have passed since folks started using these terms to describe the harm and noticing that the stuff popping up in their front yard, in their backyard, from air pollution to siting in places where their communities suddenly were populated by big box machines, poisoning their air and water, using their lands to store animal waste, and destroying people's quality of life without their permission, discussion, or even inclusion in the decision-making process. So moving back to 1996, the Southwest Environmental Network for Environmental and Economic Justice produced many pieces of really great thinking and analysis around whether or not we are looking at this at the level of patterns and determining why we are allowing people like as a body to be injured by decisions that we're making. That produced the HEMES Principles of Democratic Organizing, which specifically speak to moving the work from the bottom up and not making decisions at the top level without the consideration of people who have to live with it. If you care at all about science or are just a big old nerd like myself, the precautionary principle is a really important piece of this story. While not regarded often as a piece of environmental justice history, it is, because what it demands is that we think really clearly about what the future might hold before we make decisions. In Maryland, it's important for us to, I'll talk more about the Wingspread statement shortly, but to move really quickly into 2011, the Maryland Environmental Standing Act, which is a big part of the conversation around a constitutional right not to be harmed by decisions made about your future by interests that don't include you, is a real benchmark, because the state itself started to look at whether or not it is measuring harm to people, by what means, and is the latest piece of architecture beyond the massive environmental justice bill that just got dropped in New Jersey this week. So just want to frame some of where we're going and what we talk when we talk about harm, by replacing the precautionary principle in the context of environmental justice and saying that it is not an unusual thing to demand justice, or for yourself or for the next generation. It is not unusual to demand that if we are lacking information, we do not move ahead with things that could potentially ruin people's lives. Every single year during my time in the Maryland General Assembly, this precautionary principle snuck into the conversation around electricity generation and politics as usual, where things would be cited, whether or not we regulate our energy providers, specifically because there are tons of pieces of that we do without asking the question, what is the impact on people? That's an environmental justice principle. And moving back out from Maryland to look at our national lattice work, we are in a period of rollbacks, really severe rollbacks, and the pieces of legislation that have become the ways that we protect ourselves as a community involve this set of architecture. So the pieces of environmental justice history that I talked about to this point, and this particular grouping of policies, has made it so that the United States has historically had the most robust set of environmental laws ever. And that given that that's true, given that this set of laws to protect our air, make it so that our water is drinkable, protect our air quality, and check to make sure it's true, make sure that we're not being poisoned by toxic substances, almost all of it has been messed with, misaligned, or rolled back in this current moment that we're in. So there's bad news there.
You have to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
He's muted.
I'm muted. How odd. Yeah, so even with this robust set of laws and watching them be rolled back in a really aggressive campaign over the last 4 years, we have some problems that we had even when we had it. So even before this current campaign of terror, we were already failing on whether or not we responded to people's need for energy and gave access to the most vulnerable. We were already failing at whether or not we could provide transportation from the first mile to the last mile and keep people from choking to death on the fumes. We were already failing at recognizing climate change. If you live on the Eastern Shore or Western Maryland, flooding and mold, or if you live on the West Coast, the idea that you could be engulfed by a fire or killed by smoke. All of these things are things, even with that lattice work we weren't quite getting. YIMBY and NIMBY, yes in my backyard and no in my backyard. If you have spent any time in Ocean City listening to people argue about all the things they believe could happen to them if we happen to stop getting our energy production from fossil fuels, you are in a room full of really passionate people who are saying, yes, I want offshore wind in my yard, and people who are like, please do not put that within my view shed. And so we are already in a conversation that's moving around which of these things we will honor and hold, how we will create space for what is new, and how we're going to stop doing what's been hurting us. The big sexy conversation in environmental work that is a place where justice should be weighed in is the idea that we're suddenly going to electrify everything. We're going to electrify everything, and we're going to store all the excess energy and bring it back out through all sorts of really cool things that Maryland is considering. While all of that's true, nobody's asked the question of what are we going to do with communities that are already suffering? How are they going to be enfranchised? So this will be the point where normally I would talk about the federal government and its definition of environmental justice. But I have decided that given that, it feels like the enemy has ordered a side of everything this year, I'm not going to waste any of our time with the federal government's version of what environmental justice means. And what I can tell you is that they've decided that if you talk to people just enough so that they'll go away, you can solve problems and make people feel included. That's in a nutshell the EPA's definition of environmental justice. The reason why I'm not going to refer to it is because it doesn't go far enough. It is strictly, even in its most altruistic form, the way that the federal government deals with its own property and its ability to regulate around issues of access to land, health and environment, and the social determinants of health, how people achieve health over their lifetimes. So that's fairly useless for a number of reasons, including the fact that the federal government isn't really going to be stood up for a while. So the working definition that I would propose that we focus on is what it means to be in right relationship with folks, to include them in decisions that do not destroy their health, that make for better business because people don't spend their time fighting you about things because they've been included in the process early and often. So my definition is it's an ongoing and informed engagement between people who have been impacted and decision makers as long-term partners to determine what a fair distribution of benefits are and if there are any acceptable burdens. Examples of this include waste. If you live in Baltimore, it's actual like garbage, like who decides where it goes, where we house it, what it smells like. There's a number of things going on there. In the big picture around nuclear, it's really easy to talk about it. If cleaner energy can be given to us by nuclear power, where are we going to put the waste that doesn't go away for many, many, many lifetimes? And questions like that happening without the folks who inevitably end up being the stewards of the land where it is, cited in the places where they don't get choices. If they're not fairly brought in, we're not doing environmental justice work. So part of why I wanted to bring in those examples of a closed circle when it should be a concentric circle of conversation amongst people about the decisions we will make is because we're also talking about some subpoints in the middle of this long trip towards environmental justice. We have to talk about the distribution of benefits and burdens amongst people who will be harmed. We have to connect with people about access to making a decision before it's already been decided. All of the folks trying to figure out their relationship to Ocean City Power are really saying, will I find out that this thing will hurt me before I have had a chance to figure out for myself what that means? Am I being included in a decision point at a time when I could make some effect? I have many thoughts about this. Most of them will be upsetting, but as someone who put out the very first press release on offshore wind coming into Maryland in 2015, I could write a whole book about what has not happened yet. The justice part of this is the idea that we have to realize that everyone has the capacity to reach their highest potential if they aren't bearing the weight of all the invisible things we do not do, we do not say, and do not discuss in polite company, and shoving that off onto someone else's front yard, backyard way of living and working, and then punish people for not having access to every possible thing. So these are all sub-elements of what we have to think about when we are asking the question, when someone says that they're operating in an environmental justice framework or trying to reach justice in an environmentally sound way, are they thinking about equity? Who's at the table to have a say in the matter? And where are we trying to go? What's the future going to look like for people who are experiencing what we've decided? So there's another thing that's missing from this overview of environmental justice that I think is really important: the context. So the other reason why equity is such an important subcomponent of environmental justice is that we don't live in a world where everybody woke up with the same opportunities. Not in the United States. Nothing about our history would say so. This is a really nifty little set of boxes that can take you through the history of ways we have excluded people, from removing people from lands, to beating people when they asked about why, to making it possible for people to move on to lands without asking them who else is there and whether they agree with that, to segregating people and keeping them out of things intentionally over and over again. All you see is exclusion and removal. And like, there's so many parts of this that are right on the surface of what we have done. Figuring out who belongs where. I live in Maryland, not too far from Roland Park, which had its racially restricted covenants. The last ones ended in 1985. So if we follow this list from the Indian Removal Act in 1830 to 1985, that's how long we've been avoiding including the largest number of people who could make decisions into decision-making processes that affect their lives. So just wanted to like not think that and not say it. And I wanted to share a little bit of this history because these are things that have happened in our lifetimes, some of it. And what will happen next will be as a result of whether or not we admit that this is what's happening in the background. So an equity and justice lens, which allows us to respond to the call for environmental justice, really is about what we promote and value now, because it turns into policy and practice that impacts the health of generations. If we don't show up looking for equity, if we do not want to work in fairness, if we do not focus on where people are now and the context they're in, and when we make plans about the future, and make sure that the folks who could be harmed, continually assessing that, are brought in, we fail to serve the future. As Reverend Del Hinton would say, that we fail to make plans for the tree that we plant today, whose shade we will not seek. So if we are not making plans for the future, we are serving people up for a thing they didn't consent to. The rough part of this is that the other invisible part of the context is that there are things going on that we don't own. We don't own that. The lack of data, storytelling, and resources have resulted in standards that cut people out based on race. We have not been honest about our cultural norms of oppression, the fact that we are increasingly agnostic about science, and that we are falsely, aggressively limiting our resources in support of all of these things. Oh, it's bedtime for the smallest revolutionary in this house. Hold on just 1 second. Let me.
One of the things that we are learning in this age of COVID and working from home is that as much as we even would try to separate life and work, home and work, in the other world that we lived in, we can't do it at home in the world that we live in now. And so for all of us tomorrow who have to experience the same intersections of life, work, home, we totally understand. So
yes.
No worries at all. No worries at all.
Thank you. He's the shortest boss I've ever had, and he sure is ruthless. But so in thinking through these questions, we have to recognize that we are not in a moment where technology will solve problems that we have made by lack of relationship. So it's really important for us to raise the question, can we respond to a bunch of technological solutions if we don't care about equity, if we are not doing justice, if we're not in right relationship with people? I'm going to give you a quick answer. No, we cannot. A big surprise, we are not able to do this work without relationship with folks. And I think the most important pieces of an operationalized equity and justice framework serving an environmental justice demand is that we have to stop assuming that it's okay for people to suffer needlessly based on the choices of others. What's underneath those assumptions? No community or group or people should ever bear an outsized burden of environmental threats, ecological manipulation, or be excluded from decisions that determine their future. And we certainly shouldn't allow that to happen for money. What that means and what it requires for us to do is recognize that poverty is not biological. It's a set of choices. It's a function of design. And the only way we undo it is if we redesign. So what does that redesign look like? If we're going to actually reach environmental justice as more than a lofty goal, we're going to have to consider what it means to shift power and share power. We're going to have to operate in a new paradigm that recognizes that different cultural experiences and expertise, different languages and leadership styles must be engaged in a participatory stewardship of the thing we hold in common, which is the earth that we are on. The piece of that that's tough is that there's lots of money that has to exchange hands in order for that to happen. Redesign is not cheap. If it were, we would have done it already. And even as we start to make some of those decisions around how to right some wrongs and respond to the call for justice in the environment, we have to recognize that money isn't an imperfect form of compensation. If people have lost their health, if people have lost their families, if people do not have the benefit of clean air, clean water, soil to grow their food, there's very little that money can do to restore those things once they're spoiled. So thinking through how we develop a justice-minded outset when we look at environmental justice, it means really connecting on the restorative pieces. How do we do what we can with what we have? How do we acknowledge that people have been harmed? How do we build bridges to fix those things and admit that we know better now and we should be doing better, even if we cannot fix the harm of the past? We have to recognize it. So thinking that through, we have to raise up justice above all the other imperatives that we are facing as people. And if you would like to talk more about that, Nina knows how to get in contact with me. The rabbi can always find me, but I wanted to save some time for us to chat, depending on what the schedule is like. And I will stop sharing.
We definitely want to have some time to chat. Tamara, this was amazing. So let me just start off with the very first comment, which is that my translation, this is like a semester course you just gave us in about a half an hour. People would like to have the slides so that they can review them. Would you be able to share your show? Okay, then we can get that out to people. One of the questions that was here is, how can environmental justice help us to stop things like the Bresco contract and the city renewing the Bresco contract, even though it was first determined that it would not be renewed, and then of course it's being considered to be renewed. And I understand that Brandon Scott has also just come out to say that he was going to be supporting the renewal, even though he was against it before. Can you talk a little bit about how environmental justice intersects with something as critical to Baltimore as that?
Yeah, environmental justice is the only framework that allows us to weigh the harm to communities, the lost air, the lives lost, people endangered. It's the only lens that brings in asthma and heart attacks and the likelihood of heart disease and hypertension and stress. And it's the only framework that gives us the opportunity not just to look at whether or not Baltimore will lose money, whether or not it signed contracts, whether or not there are levels of bureaucracy between what the federal government will do, or the fact that in the early 2000s, we decided that burning trash was clean because we didn't know better. I have said this in front of the General Assembly of Maryland, that at one time we thought that lead was a sweetener and put it in all our tea, but when you know better, you need to do better. So without an environmental justice lens, we are only talking about dollars and cents, contracts that can be signed, and there's no room to bring in a lens of whether or not the harm is multi-generational and what that harm is doing to people today.
Which is critical because, as you know, one of the challenges that we've had when we are pursuing the Environmental Human Rights Amendment is the question about cost-benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see, is this amendment, is fighting for environmental justice, which is what the amendment is all about, how do we measure that in a cost-benefit analysis? Is it really, is it cost effective? So how do we sort of reframe what you just said, how do we answer that question when people whom we want to support Environmental Human Rights Amendment and other initiatives for environmental human rights say, well, you know, we have to be very hard-nosed about this and do a cost-benefit analysis. What can we say to them to overcome that seemingly very rational response?
The first thing we say is, how much data do you have on how many people go to the hospital every year as a result of X being here? what does it cost to have soil that can actually provide food for people and isn't so filled with poison that it has to be stored or burned or moved or turned into coal ash, which becomes someone else's problem? What does it mean to look at the lifetime costs of doing this business, to look at the harm to a community, not in one generation, not in 2 generations, but over the course of that entire community's life? What does it mean to live at risk and to die earlier than you should? How can you possibly weigh the business case for whether or not moving trucks, moving services, providing energy, or in this case, in certain parts of Maryland, being an importer or exporter of fuel we will never consume? How can you weigh that against the quality of life of people who suddenly woke up in a community that's not what they signed up for? You can't, there's no way to judge that. But I do think there's some calculus around how you can assess the harm, because when you look at the hospitalizations, we all end up paying for that. When you look at the early deaths that can be defined by zip code, all the lost hours of people's lives, all the days that they spend sick, all the ways that they fail to contribute to their communities because they've been struck down early and often, those things can be calculated. And it is really deeply insincere and inappropriate for organizations and entities that can bring these polluting and toxic behaviors to a community to assess what their bottom line is without talking to a community about where they are. Because there are parts of Maryland where there are 5 or 6 different things that destroy people's lives all happening at once. And the calculation that they made there is, oh, they won't make it through this first thing that happened, so we might as well just continue to compound the harm for this community because they don't have enough political clout to answer our questions or show up at our meetings or respond to our inquiry, which isn't really real, around a conversation we'd like to have during business hours when people are unavailable to look at data that you need a scientist to read. So I think there's a lot to say about that. But mostly what I would say to someone who said to me, here's a cost benefit analysis of what this business means to us, I would ask them what the harm is and whether they've done that analysis and by whose measure this is sufficient information.
Absolutely. We all know that the cost benefit analysis that they've done have not taken into consideration the costs of all the things that you just mentioned. I want to ask you in a minute about power and power shift here. There's a question in the chat, but since you just spoke about who can be at the table, can you speak just briefly about New Jersey's environmental justice bill, because it speaks directly to cumulative impact and the kinds of things that you were talking about. And it actually does slip into powers and power shift as well.
So it's a massive bill. It will probably take me a whole hour to just talk about the work of Nikki Sheets and really great folks who started to think about what it means to provide a participatory model for discussion of what happens in a community, benefits analysis that isn't just about money, and whether or not the history of poisoning a community can be a part of the conversation about where things get cited and what happens. So there's so much to say there. I will not even bother, but I will say, I think that's a whole conversation we could have, and probably invite Nikki to, just to say, what can you talk to us about this omnibus that looks at constantly piling on communities, on their air, on their water, making sure every single thing that they come in contact with is poisonous, and who owns that when so many people have been involved in destroying a community by way of overdevelopment without consent, that they've harmed folks.
So let me read the question then about power shift. Can you elaborate on what power shift and power share look like in the environmental movement across classes, colors, and generations?
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that a handful of people made decisions about what we're all doing. We woke up in a set of agreements we didn't necessarily have any say in. And the power shift, power share is asking the question, what does it mean when one person, the governor of Maryland, can work through a bunch of systems that it is really difficult to communicate in? And if you ever tried to get parking in Annapolis, you realize it's pretty difficult to get a word in edgewise, even if you have 12 hours a day to wait just to talk for 3 minutes. So like the entire structure under which we make decisions with folks who should be our proxy is held in the hands of people who don't have time to talk to community, who don't always make that space. That's not true for every legislator. That's not true for every city council person. That's not true for every alderman, but the power that those escalating groups have, should be weighted by how often they get in contact with people. So for example, a governor can make decisions about infrastructure. We are fighting natural gas infrastructure fights up and down the coast of Maryland and have been for a long time. Those pieces of infrastructure will set back our ability to fight emissions, will spend our carbon budget, and will put things in the ground that it'll take 2 or 3 generations to deal with before, and that's having nothing to do with the fact the problems show up fairly immediately, from the construction, the extraction, the loss of land use for things that could be healthful that people make choices about. So the power shift, power share is deciding with a community that will be impacted if this is a thing they want to deal with. Do they want to spend their lives digging out from decisions that they made when they were told there were only benefits on this side? Not the fact that this entity that is proposing to move a wheelabrator or import-export terminal, or even a compressor station or a well pad or a pipeline into your community has looked at the health records of your community. Because if any of those things come in and your community is already suffering from air quality because Wheelabrator's air moves all over, because Pennsylvania is really just a pass-through for filthy air coming into the state of Maryland. Even if we did everything we need to do right, if we don't have harmonized discussions about what is an acceptable amount of harm for people through an environmental justice framework, we just continue to see dollar signs and fail to see the real losses on the books that aren't being recorded.
So some of the laws that New Jersey just passed and the laws that we need to pass create a requirement for participation, meaningful participation, as you were talking about, of people who might be impacted. And that could be structurally required. And as we know, the Commission on Sustainable Communities, I think it's called, in Maryland, was just called out because the community seat, a seat that was reserved for community partners, was actually being occupied by a corporate person. And so I know that in Maryland, we are now looking again. Ben Grumples and the Secretary of the MDE are looking again at who should be sitting on that commission. But so Ethan, I think that's really part of part of the answer, is that we put into law and the structures of how people can participate. And by the way, this new Zoom world is potentially going to be helping people participate in hearings a lot more than they were able to do before. Because I know if the rest of you have done what Tamara and I have done, basically given up a whole day to drive to Annapolis to find parking there, which is impossible, to sit there for 12 hours to talk for 3 minutes in a hearing. It's kind of distressing. Who else is there? All the lobbyists who have the time and the money, to sit there all day, every day.
I do want to add that the power sharing piece is about recognizing that the budget, the decisions around zoning, where people, whether or not you even look at the health records to find out what people have been experiencing, that's not looking at people's individual records, but what do the public health records say about the overall health of a community? Those kinds of small things shift power from people who show up and can back up an entire truck full of data about what they might lose if you don't give them a contract, and allow them to compete with folks who say, this is how many lives have been lost by what's already going on here. Here's where we're already vulnerable. You want to put a highway over my community that's going to put long rail trucks going past my house from the first mile to the last mile. If 80% of my community already has asthma or COPD or other respiratory problems, you will finish off the people who could have survived. You will cut short the lives of children who could have really healthy lungs and then not be less subject to COVID. So I do think that there are places where just opening up the information creates power sharing, because the information being withheld is a form of power. The power sharing is when you allow people to act on that. The idea of cumulative impacts, when it was proposed in Maryland and has been powerfully proposed and really thought about in New Jersey, is that if we are able to implement a holistic view of what happens in the long run to people, if you keep saying yes to the folks with enough money to tell you whatever you would like to know, and to totally ignore the externalities as they fall into community, that has a cumulative impact over time. And beyond the fact that it's just difficult to say really quickly in 3 minutes, the other barriers to entry on getting that kind of law passed have been that legislators want to look at development piecemeal, but communities experience it as a whole.
And for those who are thinking about how they might in another couple of weeks, as we learn a little bit more, how they might in fact move from learning to action, know that there will be a cumulative impact bill reintroduced here in the state of Maryland. There are initiatives that say we have to make access to information much easier. We have social media, we have websites. Our agencies in the state must make access to information so much easier so that we are empowered to make those decisions. So thank you, Tamara. All right, more questions. Other states require environmental impact reporting requirements before decisions are taken on development proposals. This might help shine a bright light on EJ considerations. What are the prospects for Maryland implementing such requirements?
So interestingly enough, environmental impact statements, environmental impact assessments have been a tool that have been around for a really long time. The problem is that an environmental impact statement only looks at what you can prove based on the data that you have, not the data that you do not have. Part of why I am one of the 3 people who missed the EPA, but also have a little side eye when I think about it, is that for the longest time, the EPA was unable to really give you a set of facts about whether people were being harmed, not because they weren't collecting data, but because their own baselines did not factor in diversity. So one of the reasons why there are very few cases of enforcement at the EPA is because the raw data got, the algorithms got broken whenever you looked at communities of color. So one of the things that has to happen before you determine whether people are harmed is you look at baseline information. So if the baseline community that you're looking at is full of one group of people who are homogenous, then you have already broken the ability for that data collection tool to give you all the information if the community is full of people who aren't recognized. So if it's a diverse community, even if the demographics are off by age or sex or gender or race, if it measures those things, it does not measure what the impacts are to people in those categories. So if you don't show up with the right pieces of information, looking at the problem in the exact right light, you don't get information on why communities saying we're harmed. And when a developer goes to the EPA to say, here's a single thing I'd like to do. I'm a business, I want to bring a service. It's currently approved in all these other ways. I would like to do this thing. The data only looks at what that one entity is doing. Not about the 14 other permits that happen at the state level, not the municipality and waste level permits for waste, and not the federal level versions that all together would tell a story about whether or not people live in a safe environment, whether or not they're unduly being burdened with risk. So I think it's really, really key that we focus on the environmental impact assessment, the environmental impact statement as ways to get some of the information. Other things that we could do in line with that are looking at health impact assessments, which is really just pulling the local data on whether or not a community is already full of sick people who can withstand another thing coming into their community. So an EIS in combination with a health impact assessment might start to give you that duty and would create opportunities for people who are impacted to weigh in on whether they even want this thing before it's already set and done. It's a done deal. The other thing that is really important around an EIS or EIA is that it doesn't look at the financial assessment of lack of health. And there have been really incredible pieces of legislation raised in Maryland around the idea that the financial cost of unhealthy people, the financial cost of earth that cannot yield healthy food, water that's drinkable or swimmable or fishable, like the financial loss of not having those things is not a part of the calculation that a developer presents when they're pushing for something to happen, or when a regulator says yes to it, or very rarely, if ever, ask more questions. So I just want to flag that, like, all of these tools are great, but if they're looked at in absentia, they don't tell us whole story.
This is a question from Brad Schlegel, and I ask it, so if you're able to answer this particular question, that's great, but I want to ask it to you because I think it also presents a systemic problem, and I think that there are a variety of ways we can answer it, but we all have to figure out how to answer it. So he says, we have no more landfill space, so how do we deal with the trash now being burned at Bresco? So the question is, when we know that in order to achieve what we need to achieve to save the health of the earth and the people who depend on it, when we believe that we might not currently have the technological skills or the capacity to do it, how do we get there? So the specific and the general question.
Yeah, so specifically on landfills, there was a really incredible bill that's never ever made it to committee in Maryland, demanding that we stop putting mattresses in landfills. Now, that's a really incredible piece of legislation that's come through the health committee and failed every daggone year, not just because it didn't get called or didn't get the opportunity, but because no one wanted to consider that a mattress is full of wood and steel. And you could take off the cotton and the material and recycle all of it. You can give it to for other uses. And because that bill doesn't come up, we got mountains of mattresses stacked under the earth for no real reason. So just want to say that there are practical elements of why we do not do this. And then there are other considerations around falsehoods. So because burning trash for energy was clean at a moment when we did not have the science on all the invisible things going into the atmosphere, or we didn't yet have a perfected version of that science, it was deemed clean. So in the early 2000s, in the administration that most progressive folks are super happy about, this stuff went on all day. Clean energy. We're just going to burn the waste. We're not going to keep anything in the ground. Also, there's this stuff called coal ash. We're just going to put it in the earth, and it's not going to show up in the groundwater. It's not going to blow into people's faces. It's not going to darken their windows. Just a whole bunch of stuff that we told ourselves that just wasn't true. And had we asked any communities where this stuff started going on at first, they would have said, it blackens your lungs, it blackens your windows, it destroys your health, it makes you sick. So this is a place where failing to look at just the issue of landfills provides a really great case study on what it would be like if we had an environmental justice framework that allowed people to interject the expertise they have into the conversations that exclude them.
And also, I would say it's a chicken and egg thing. If there's not a requirement to divert the trash from the incinerator, right, then we won't have the answers for what do you do with the trash that it does not go to the incinerator. But once we have the requirement, because of all sorts of reasons, especially environmental justice, that says we have to reduce the amount of trash that we create, all of a sudden I have a funny feeling that corporations and manufacturers and designers and designers of plastic, they will all of a sudden understand that maybe the market forces are pushing them to do something differently. And without those market forces, we might not get to the place where we need to go. But sometimes we have to put either the chicken before the egg, whichever one you think is first, so that we can force the initiative and we can force technology to move in the direction that we want it to move.
Yeah, and we can do some of it through market forces. There are folks who will not sell you plastic because enough people have said, I'm not going to pay to keep this problem going. I'm going to divest myself from this market space. Because the other thing in my day job at 350 that I talk about isn't just ending fuels, but that the other end of fossil fuel extraction is plastics. So the other business that the people who are destroying the earth and making it uninhabitable are also packaging all the stuff that we're going to need on the way to not getting what we want. So it's really important for us to make better connections, to talk to people who are feeling the harm in Maryland and Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley, where they are currently planning on an ethane cracker that will produce an unnecessary and ungodly number of plastic devices and processes. All of that stuff is connected to whether or not the government is listening about what it is we want to do with our money in the future and our common wheel of the resources that we have. It's part of why thinking about an amendment that really thinks about our health and the future of the next generations means inviting more people to the conversation. And I agree with Nina that the flattening of hearings has created a real ruckus, as Zoom channels are busy every night full of people who are like, well, I'm already home, so I might as well talk to you about what's happening in my zoning, in the zoning ordinance, because I was just going to have a sandwich and I'd rather talk to you. So I do think this is a rare opportunity brought to us by a set of I'll call it a syndemic, multiple pandemics hitting us at once, each thing so terrible that it could take out your life. In this moment, one of the things we could do with it is be a heck of a lot more active, because all of these public hearings now show up in your computer, on your phone. And if we ask these questions and raise them enough, the government that takes our money, our resources, and our vote should be responsive. Which is another demand of the principles of environmental justice, is that we have a say in things that harm us.
Right. And going back to the power shifting, the fact is you don't even have to feel that you have to say anything about the hearings, even just showing up. There's a difference between 10 people looking at the hearing and watching the hearing and 250 people watching the hearing. Just letting the legislators know that you are watching will begin to change the way that they approach this particular question. And also I want to just mention, before I get to Bernadette's question, Peggy Myers says, if companies who create the plastics are responsible to reduce or eliminate them, we will have progress. And I just wanted to say that Delegate Brooke Lehrman is in fact introducing a bill which would require the companies to be responsible for the materials and the packaging that they create, and not putting the burden on the consumer to figure out how to recycle or not recycle, because we actually don't control the recycling. All we can do is put something in a can and then hope that it gets recycled. But I know in Baltimore County, only 15% of what we recycle actually gets recycled. Right, cradle to grave accountability, Bernadette says. Bernadette, let me go back to your other question. It is sometimes hard to believe that differences in life expectancies, for example, by neighborhood, it's sometimes hard to believe that there are these differences in life expectancies, for example, by neighborhood. Do you have any examples of such things in Maryland? And I mean this in the sense of environmental issues that degrade health.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, the environmental health, the social determinants, like the things that you do in your everyday life and interact with, they interact with your genetics, deliver you to a place we call health. And everybody who's ever been alive knows that that's not a permanent place. But the amount of time you get to be in health is a factor of a bunch of things. I live in a neighborhood that's adjacent to Roland Park, where the zip code there, people live 30 years longer than they do in any other zip code in Maryland. That is not about the fact that Bresco is polluting the air. It's about the confluence of Bresco polluting the air, people having a higher quality of life, access to healthy food, and transportation that allows them to have agency and lowers their level of stress. So when we look at life expectancy between a couple of zip codes, we're looking at a confluence of conditions that allow people to achieve health or keep them from achieving health. And that's the place where getting the data from the Department of Health locally in Baltimore, at the state level, is really key to looking at what the price is that people are paying for a lack of access.
All right, and any more questions? Loss of trees. That's what I think. Bernadette, why don't you unmute yourself and you can speak the last comment if you would like to do that.
Sure. I just wanted to say, if you would like to save the chat for all these wonderful links. I noticed Tamara just posted a link of the 17 principles of environmental justice, for example. And it will save any links that you got in private chats. I actually had quite a few people, it was very wonderful, that answered my question before Tamara got to it. So I have some great resources now to click on and look at after the meeting. But anyway, if you want to save the chat, you just click on the 3 little dots in the chat box, and there's a save chat feature. And it will even open up a box that says, here's where it's saved. And so it'll tell you where it's saving it. So it's kind of helpful.
Great.
There's one last question there about Department of Health. Well, one thing I would say is that the head of the Department of Health is an excellent person to ask these questions to. He is involved in public meetings, where you should ask all of these things. The Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance is another place that really looks at what the differences are between where you live and where your neighbors live, and shows some really interesting storytelling in what people are exposed to based on their zip code. But I do think the Department of Health is a public institution. In most places, they do not have enough funds to respond to basic questions that people have about whether or not they are more or less likely to be sick in a specific way. That's because it happens in space people aren't usually paying attention to. So I think that one of the things that is really important to recognizing that environmental justice is a longer arc of things that have to be done. When you put a filter of cumulative impacts and justice into the conversation around what people are getting, is recognizing that all of it responds to sunlight. If you are paying attention to the system, it will respond to your attention. And that's what we're trying to build here, as a community of people that are paying attention and deciding together that they will focus on what the future looks like by raising the right questions today.
Judith Parkman, if you want to learn more about those differences. There's this book, Not in My Neighborhood, exactly. Yes, and again, I want to encourage everyone to begin to imagine what they might be doing at the end of these 5 weeks to address issues of environmental justice. And we have power just by showing up. We have power just to show up and ask questions. You don't have to feel like we have to be the experts or that we have to have the answers, but show up and ask questions. And that's one way that we can make a difference and do this power shift. I want to ask before we close, anyone wants to have additional questions, please put them in the chat now. Tamara, I want to ask something which is a difficult question, something that we were struggling with, the team who was putting this together. We want to reach out to and work with those communities that are impacted. And we're finding that it's hard. It's hard to figure out the right platform, the right time, the right way. I mean, I can't see all of us here, but I would imagine that many of us on this call are probably white and do not necessarily imagine ourselves coming from those impacted communities. What is the best way that we can work with impacted communities?
So the interesting thing is that environmental racism and the way it shows up as a lack of environmental justice is about race. But environmental justice is about being excluded from things that can kill you over and over again and systematically. That's happening in rural settings where you can't find melanin for miles. That's happening in urban spaces where people are also being hit with violent disservices and lack of financial resources. So just to flag that, I think the keys to relationship building are the same regardless of who you are talking to. Do you care about me? Will you listen to my version of what is happening? And will you engage me at the level of what I'm asking you for? And that's really what environmental justice is will you see me? Will you help me answer these questions? Do you care about my thoughts about whether or not this thing happens? And do I have the opportunity to intervene, or will you make decisions on my behalf? So I think connecting with communities around where the pain points are and offering to just listen, just to hear people out is the best thing I've ever seen happen for communities who are struggling with lack of access and detrimental outcomes. So I think joining the fight is the best way to make friends.
Right, and it's at, around what table and in what place and what time. I mean, often Zoom is fine, but not always great for everybody. I mean, sometimes you just have to show up in places that you don't expect you were going to be showing up in. So there's a little bit of discomfort that sometimes we have to absorb in order to do this. And
there's a saying in my house, but no man's ever been hit over the head while doing the dishes.
Right, we just have
so if you show up in community, this is a set of skills that I have. Is it useful here? It's really difficult not to make a friend.
Right, great. Any last questions for Tamara? All right, yes, we can all put our thanks in the chat. Tamara, this is fabulous. You are, as always, so wonderful and overwhelming. So we're going to be looking forward to seeing your slides and watching this again so that we can capture all of the wisdom that you brought forth to us. We are ever so grateful for taking your time and taking your time away from your family to do this for us. So.
Thank you. Such a great conversation, and super glad to seeing us all get together to push for the right thing. Really appreciate you, Nina, as always. Deeply appreciate this community and excited to work together.
Great. And we are just in week 1 of 5 weeks. So next week, and I think our next week's presenter actually was participating tonight too, is Rebecca Rear, the Director of Climate Health Program at Eco America, where she works to build public support and political will for climate solutions. She'll speak about climate justice, and the little secret that some of us know is that Rebecca also worked at the Maryland Environmental Health Network, which is of course where Tamara was the director. So the Maryland Environmental Health Network was a fabulous organization, and we are ever so grateful for all the work that they did and for the reports that they put out. I also want to thank the team that worked so hard to put this program together. And that is Claire Miller, Jenny Neslage. Actually, Jenny, I've never said your name out loud before, your last name, so you'll have to tell me how to pronounce it. Actually, you want to just take yourself off of mute and tell me how to pronounce it?
Neslage, thank you.
Neslage, wonderful. Ken Phelps, Bernadette Roche, Kathy Shahinian, and Dick Williams. So they're our partners in at heart, as I would call them. They're just wonderful. Thank you all for putting this all together. And with that, we wish you all
Hello?
well. Come?
Hello?
Yes?
I'm sorry, this is Von Tasha here.
Yes, Fantasha.
Just one brief answer when you talk about when you feel that, you know, being particularly white or something like that, how do you get into particular communities to be able to address the community, to show that you care about the community? Being someone of color myself, I find that the best way is just getting into the community and speaking to people and being honest with people. You know, people will see past that, and people will know and understand that you really care about the community and not particularly concerned about your race or anything like that. So
I love that, and I love the way Tamara put it, that, you know, no one's going to get angry at you if you do their dishes or something like
exactly,
that.
exactly.
Get in there, you do the hard work with them, but you got to show up. You got to show up to their place. You got to show up to their kitchen, right? And that's what we have to learn how to do. Vantasha, it's great to see you. I'm so glad that you're here. And with that, I want to say, as we all came in peace and we were together in peace, may we all leave in peace and return in peace next week. So thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.